Hello, students. Mr. Passeri here, and it is Friday, and it is sunny out for now. Since we've got a little bit of time, I thought I would do a video for the Google Classroom / YouTube channel where we talk a bit about the Jefferson presidency, which is the topic of your weekly reading and questions. So there's going to be a lot of familiar themes in this chapter if you are someone who tends to be keeping up with current events. Namely, there is a lot of what's known as political antagonism, which is just a fancy way to say different political groups attack each other with malice or intense dislike, possibly hatred, despite the fact that they are part of the same class, the same social and economic status. So very vitriolic, combative attitude between political rivals, and that is definitely something that we see, I think, unfortunately, during the last 4 years. And I'm not saying that this is President Trump's fault, because I don't think it is. I just think that the current president and the Democratic Party and the media are all very much at odds with each other, and they've all got their pros and cons, and despite the fact that they're part of the same social and economic group, they all have different ideas about government's role, etiquette, how people should behave, and rather than having a more diplomatic way of solving those differences, there's a lot of sniping and name-calling and, unfortunately, antagonizing. And I think all of the political groups that I just mentioned are responsible for that, but it's important that you know that these things that are happening right now didn't just come out of nowhere. There's actually a rich tradition of political antagonism in U.S. history. So that's pretty much what you read about. Another major issue that's in the news right now is, again, the issue of federalism, right? We're doing distance learning, and every state in the United States has different ideas about when to open up their states after quarantine, how to open up their states after quarantine, how to do this as part of the United States to ensure safety for the citizens of the United States as a country, so one state isn't sending off one dangerous signal to other states, so that the states in the United States act both with their own culture and freedom and discretion, but at the same time isn't creating either a situation of humanitarian disaster or political disrespect that can lead to instability across the country. So this is something that back in the late 17, early 1800s is also a very big issue. The issue of how much freedom do the states have, how much freedom does the federal government have, and what party likes what preference, which party prefers a stronger federal government, what party prefers more to the states' rights situation. Now, another thing in your reading that is going to be a little tricky is the Republican Party that is being talked about in your reading is not the Republican Party that exists today, although it does take similar positions to the Republican Party today in the fact that states' rights is the preferred method of federalism. The Republican Party that is talked about in your reading is the Democratic Republican Party of Thomas Jefferson. That party ultimately morphs into the current Democratic Party that we have now. So, but they're called in your reading the Republicans. So when you read Republicans in your reading, it's not talking about Donald Trump's party or George Bush's party. It's talking about Thomas Jefferson's political party that falls more on the side of states' rights, more on the side of trying to speak the language of the common person, which our current Republican Party, I think, tries to do a bit more than the Democrats. And I'm not taking sides. I mean, both parties, again, have their pros and cons. And my job isn't to, editorialize on those, at least not right now, right? So there's that. And then, of course, we're going to get into the issue of Supreme Court judges, which, again, this past few years was a big issue during the Trump administration because the president appoints Supreme Court judges, and then those judges end up having a big influence on how the Constitution is interpreted and just the general legal direction of the country. So you're going to learn and you're reading about the John Marshall Supreme Court, and that Supreme Court is going to fall very much on the side of big government as opposed to states' rights. And again, there's arguments for both. The argument for big government is you have stability, you have clarity, and if you have enlightened, educated people at the top of that centralized power, things can run smoothly and things can run justly. The side of states' rights, though, says that too much power centralized in one location becomes abusive and out of touch with the people they claim to be representing and ruling. And so they can say they're enlightened all they want, but they don't understand the people that they are in charge of, to the point where they are now going to start abusing and disrespecting the people that they are in charge of. And if the states have more rights, they can better manage their own affairs and cultures more justly than a centralized government. So those are the pros and cons of big government versus states' rights. Starting off with the election of 1800, this is a very contentious election between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. Now, the Federalists are going to be led by John Adams, George Washington's lovable sidekick. The Federalists are going to be in favor of big government, and John Adams is going to be the second president after George Washington. Challenging John Adams for a second term is Washington's Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, and author of the Declaration of Independence in large part, Thomas Jefferson. Now, Thomas Jefferson is an interesting person because Thomas Jefferson is going to very much come down on the side of states' rights, very much come down on the side of personal freedom, very much come down on the side of revolutionary politics when it comes to international affairs like France, very much want to kind of present himself as a man of the people. And do you know what balances out all of this revolutionary populism and democratic philosophy of Thomas Jefferson? He's a slave owner. So he can say all he wants, how much he loves the freedom of the little guy, and he's a man of the people, but he also owns people. So you need to keep that in context. And that also is a big theme that you'll see in history and politics, that people kind of balance out their personalities with extreme positions, right? So Thomas Jefferson's a slave owner, but what keeps him grounded while being a slave owner is being this philosophical enthusiast of democratic rights and revolutionary politics. Now, would he want those things done to him by his slaves? Absolutely not. Is he a hypocrite? In a word, yes. But should that discount all of the positive things that his philosophical perspectives and states' rights policies do? No. And again, I think you can, and this is going to be super controversial, draw a bit of a parallel between Jefferson and Trump, in the sense that Trump is a billionaire businessman. You may hate him, you may love him, but despite being a billionaire businessman with a spray tan and a supermodel wife and huge resorts. He is one of those men of the people type guys. He's the guy who seeks to speak the language of the common person, at least the common working class, rural, not necessarily exclusively white, but that kind of person, and it will more appeal to the the poor white male. Jefferson, similar, okay, in that sense. They both have that white working class male populist kind of desire or to communicate with that group, despite being obscenely wealthy and having an insane amount of power over the common person, right? So again, these themes that you deal with today exist in the past. So Jefferson and John Adams had a very bitter presidential campaign. You might remember that from Hillary and Trump. And remember, I'm not going to go into all the insults that they lobbied back and forth at each other, because some of them are inappropriate for school. But Jefferson, at this time, was accused of being godless, which back in the 1800s was a big insult, because Jefferson was more of a deist. He did believe in God, but he did not believe in the idea of an established state. No one believed in established state religion, but he was more of the idea that there is a God and that there's merit to theology, but not really pinning himself down to a single standardized religion. And Adams really hit on that to try to take the Christian majority and take people's devotion to their faith and make them afraid of Thomas Jefferson being an atheist, someone who does not believe in God and arguably looks down on or despises people who believe in God, and will rule in a way that is not Christian or not ethical. Jefferson's counter was that Adams was a monarch. That king that we overthrew a few decades ago? He's back in the form of John Adams and the Federalists, trying to take away all your freedoms. Incidentally, again, very common in terms of our political rhetoric today, right? You don't like someone in charge, they're a fascist dictator, right? And the Republicans say that about the Democrats, and the Democrats say that about the Republicans. I'm not in charge, you're a dictator. So again, this kind of hyperbolic rhetoric, this over-the-top rhetoric, it has its very roots in U.S. politics at its very early stages. So some of you out there might like the play Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson did not get along because Thomas Jefferson being on the sides of states' rights, Alexander Hamilton being in the Federalist camp, had two different views of how the United States should proceed in balancing Federalist power. But there's another person that Alexander Hamilton didn't like even more than Thomas Jefferson, and that was Aaron Burr. Now, I'm not a huge expert at the traditional method of presidential electoral politics because it's a bit complicated. It's more complicated than what we have now. But you had a ticket of people running for president and vice president. And then once that group won, president and vice president would be voted on again within that ticket. So it was almost like you voted for president and vice president. You'd have four, and then once that one group of president and vice president won, then you would vote within that group to see who would be the president. And Jefferson's running mate was Aaron Burr. Now, there was a tie between votes for Jefferson and Burr, and Alexander Hamilton was able to swing the votes toward Jefferson to make it so that Aaron Burr did not become president. Now, this situation, this rivalry between Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton boils over to the point of personal insults, political, career sabotage, and then ultimately dueling, which results in Alexander Hamilton dying. So watch the famous milk commercial, because Alexander Hamilton takes the L in the duel to Aaron Burr. And there's a great commercial from the early 90s where a guy is trying to win a contest. He manages the Alexander Hamilton Museum, and he's eating a big peanut butter sandwich. And he needs milk so he can swallow his sandwich and win this contest, this radio contest, where the answer is Aaron Burr. And all he can say is, and it's hilarious. So look it up on YouTube. So, okay. So that's talked about in your reading. And again, something else that's again in your reading that is, I think, relevant is the idea of laissez-faire. Now, one of the topics, again, that's actually more debated in my lifetime now than it has been in decades before, is the idea of socialism versus capitalism. For decades upon decades upon decades, socialism, and it still kind of is today, was always something of a boogeyman or a scary word in U.S. politics, despite the fact that democratic governments all over the world are openly socialistic. Some governments are not democratic and call themselves socialistic. Others are, countries like Italy, France, England, socialistic without calling themselves socialist governments. And then you have other governments like China that are one party controlled, and we would call them a dictatorship. In their country, they would not call themselves a dictatorship, but they're very much like, we're a socialist country. So why do I bring up the idea of socialism? Socialism is the idea that the government controls the economy in the name of the people. Okay, but there's a term in your book, laissez-faire. And that means let the people do as they choose, okay? Laissez-faire on paper is the idea behind capitalism, okay? Which means that you have a market that is open to everyone to sell goods and buy goods. And the competition of the market based on individual choice will have the best rise to the top. And so capitalist people like the term laissez-faire because that is the ideal version of capitalism. Now, of course, capitalism is much more complex than that, and socialism is also more complex than what I described, and really most governments have a combination of capitalist laissez-faire and socialist government control. But, the extremes are always what's presented in textbooks, and Jefferson very much fell on the side of laissez-faire, let the people choose. Of course, he's not going to let his slaves choose to not be slaves, but I'm just throwing that out there to be kind of a jerk, but also to complicate things, because again, I don't think Jefferson's ideas should be dismissed just because he's a slave owner. You can have great ideas that can be true and still be doing terrible things at the same time. You have to understand the context, and you have to understand complexity, right? You should be critical of Jefferson for being a slave owner, but if Jefferson says 1 + 1 is 2, and he happens to be a slave owner, 1 + 1 is still 2, okay? So just keep that in mind. One other thing. Before Adams left office, he packed as many Federalist judges on the courts as he could. This is kind of interesting because now, although this again is coming up because Obama is coming out, was doing what he could to help the Democrats against Trump right up until the day he left office, apparently, which is coming out increasingly in the news. Adams wanted to make sure that Jefferson was going to have to deal with as many Federalist judges as possible, so it would be harder for Jefferson to get his Democratic-Republican ideas legally enforced. So you have things like the midnight judges that you see where, really right up until the last second before he leaves office, John Adams is trying to pack as many Federalist judges by appointing them as he can as president. So one other really important thing in your reading before I end this video is the idea of judicial review. Okay, Marbury versus Madison. When I was student teaching, I student taught under a teacher that always drilled it into the students' head that Marbury versus Madison established judicial review, because that was a question on the New York State Regents all the time. And what judicial review does is three things. Number one, it says that the Constitution is the supreme law. The Constitution must be followed when there is a conflict or disagreement between it and any other law. And three, the judicial branch must uphold the Constitution and nullify/cancel unconstitutional laws. So basically, it's saying that the Supreme Court is the final say over all other laws, and that the Constitution will be followed above all other laws. And if there is a disagreement between laws, you have to pivot back to the Constitution. And again, the final say in this is the Supreme Court. Okay, now, Jefferson, being a Republican, Democratic Republican, is going to have to deal with the Supreme Court that is deeply federalist, right? That is almost always under John Marshall going to come down on the side of big government, okay? And, one big example of that is McCulloch versus Maryland. In that case, again, is going to say that the federal government, Congress, is going to be allowed to do more than the limits of the Constitution. By what I mean is that just because the Constitution says you can't do it doesn't mean that Congress can't do it. Okay? So the verbiage in your book is that the court held that Congress is allowed to do more than the Constitution expressly authorizes it to do. Okay? So there you have it, guys. That's just kind of my take on your reading this week, giving you a little bit of more depth to some ideas, trying to connect some things to current events. Your work is due a week from when I posted it. Okay, check the date on the classroom. I can't remember it off the top of my head, but it's due at midnight that night. Take care, stay safe, and I will see you in the very near future. Check the classroom often, and wear a mask if you're going outside and going in a store. Bye-bye.